The Nemean Lion. King Eurystheus had known of Heracles for some time and was deeply jealous of him. The two were cousins as they shared descent from Perseus, however, they were nothing alike. Heracles was strong and heroic, whereas Eurystheus was cowardly and weak, often sending others to fight his battles for him. Arriving in servitude, Heracles bowed before his cousin Eurystheus, who could barely contain his joy. Quickly accepting Heracles' service, the king instructed him to carry out 10 labors over a period of 10 years, only after which would he be forgiven for his crimes. There was only one caveat, however: these labors would have to be completed without any assistance or payment. Heracles hung his head in shame, asking what his first labor would be. King Eurystheus told him of a ferocious lion that had been terrorizing a village in the northeast part of his kingdom named Nemea. The lion could not be stopped. Its golden hide was impervious to weapons, and its claws were sharper than any sword known to man. It had killed all those sent against it, and the task would now lay with Heracles, who was sent to slay the beast. Aware that no sword or spear could penetrate the lion's hide, Heracles trained for several months, uprooting trees and lifting boulders to increase his strength. Stronger than ever, he could now confront the beast with his bare hands. Upon arriving at the lion's den, Heracles passed the bodies of warriors, their swords and axes shattered on the floor. The lion then appeared and began to charge toward him, but just before it was about to pounce, Heracles stepped to the side, catching its neck in his arms. The two wrestled for hours, but when Heracles managed to get a good grasp on the lion's throat, he squeezed with all his might until he heard a crack. The dead beast fell down to the floor. His first labor was complete. Realizing the lion's pelt would aid him in his upcoming labors, he pulled out one of its razor-sharp claws, using it to skin the animal. He then threw the pelt around his shoulders like a cloak, using the lion's head as a protective hood. As Heracles left the lair, he found a giant oak tree, which he lifted from the ground and stripped of its branches, whittling it into a club. This would be his new weapon, and the lion skin his new armor, symbols of his path to redemption. As Heracles returned to Mycenae, draped in the pelt of the Nemean lion, Eurystheus was shocked, never imagining his cousin would make it back alive. Labor 2. The Lernaean Hydra. For his second labor, Heracles was sent to kill the Lernaean Hydra. And so he traveled to Lake Lerna, near the city of Argos, where the fearsome water serpent had made its home. Known as the Hydra, this beast had 9 heads, one of which was immortal, with its blood the most poisonous substance known to man. Upon his journey to face the creature, however, Hera wanted to make the challenge more difficult, hiding a giant crab deep within the lake. When Heracles arrived, he charged at the Hydra with his club, and with a massive swing took one of its heads clean off. But to his horror, where one head had been, 2 new heads emerged in its place. Confused, Heracles began to cut off more heads, but this only made the situation worse, as each time one head was removed, 2 more would spawn. As he was grappling with the beast, Hera's giant crab would jump out from the water, pinning Heracles to the ground. With the 2 monsters attacking him, Heracles was sure that his death was close. But as the Hydra moved toward him, an arrow flew out of the bushes and struck it in the side. Heracles turned around to see his nephew Iolaus aiming a bow at the monster. The boy had followed his uncle to the lake, hoping to help in any way he could. With the monsters distracted, Heracles reached for his club, swinging it with such force that he crushed the giant crab in a single blow. With his nephew now by his side, as Heracles sliced off a head, Iolaus would then cauterize the Hydra's neck with a flaming torch, preventing any more heads from growing. The pair worked together for hours, slicing and cauterizing, until finally no more heads remained. Heracles then knelt beside the Hydra's body, dipping the tip of his arrows in its poisonous blood. The slightest scratch from one of these arrows would prove fatal, something that would aid him in his upcoming labors. Despite defeating the Hydra, Eurystheus did not count this labor, as Heracles had been assisted by his nephew Iolaus, and therefore an additional 11th labor would have to be completed. As Heracles and Iolaus left the lake, to thank the crab for its service, Hera took its remains and cast its image up into the heavens, creating the constellation Cancer. Labor 3, the Ceryneian Hind. For his third labor, Heracles was ordered to catch the Ceryneian hind and bring it back alive to Eurystheus. The hind was a beautiful creature, much like a stag, with bronze-like hooves and a magnificent pair of golden antlers. Heracles then set off to Mount Cerynea where the creature lived, but the hind was extremely fast, being nearly impossible to catch, with Heracles chasing his prey for a full year before he was able to capture it. Infuriated that his cousin had completed the task so easily, Eurystheus would quickly set Heracles his fourth labor to capture the Erymanthian Boar. Labor 4, the Erymanthian Boar. For his fourth labor, Eurystheus sent Heracles to Mount Erymanthus to capture alive a giant boar that had been ravaging the area. Not thinking much of the task, Heracles set off with enthusiasm, even deciding to visit his friend, the centaur Pholus, along the way. Centaurs were half men, half horse creatures, renowned for acting more like beasts than humans. Pholus was an exception, however, being both friendly and intelligent, and had been friends with Heracles since his youth. After Heracles arrived, Pholus decided to host a dinner party to honor his guest, inviting a few of the local centaurs, one of whom was Heracles' old, intelligent, and immortal archery teacher Chiron. As the feast began, everything was going well. Heracles reminisced with his old teacher, before deciding to take a walk. On the way out, he came across a jar of wine on Pholus's shelf, which he decided to crack open and take a large helping of. Little did he know that the wine was communal property of all the centaurs, something the god Dionysus had gifted them 4 generations earlier. The wine also had a powerful odor that the centaurs could smell for miles around. As Heracles returned, he was confronted by a huge crowd of centaurs demanding to know why he had drunk their sacred wine. His friends Pholus and Chiron tried to calm down the other centaurs, but the situation soon got out of hand as the whole tribe had arrived, drawn by the wine's odor. Enraged, the centaurs tried to kill Heracles, but despite their numbers, they were unable to overpower him. In defense, Heracles began shooting them with his arrows coated in the poisonous Hydra blood, killing many, with the rest then fleeing. Unfortunately, in the chaos, Heracles had accidentally shot his old teacher Chiron, who fell down screaming in agony. As he was immortal, the wound did not kill him, but with the Hydra's poison coursing through his veins, he would spend an eternity in pain. Zeus, however, had watched the events unfold and decided to take pity on the old centaur, taking Chiron's spirit and casting it up into the heavens, creating the constellation Sagittarius. Confused as to how such a small arrow had killed the other centaurs, Pholus picked an arrow up from the ground. As he lifted it up to his face to take a closer look, the arrow slipped from his fingers, landing on his hoof, with the poison killing him within seconds. After chasing the other centaurs away, Heracles returned, but when he found that he had killed both his friend and his teacher, he was overcome with shame and regret. But unknown to Heracles, a centaur called Nessus was able to survive the massacre, running far into the mountains, where he would spend over a decade planning his revenge on the hero. Heracles completed his actual labor with ease, chasing the boar into deep snow, where he bound it in chains to bring back to Eurystheus. Upon seeing the giant monster, Eurystheus was petrified, quickly jumping into a large storage jar, refusing to come out until Heracles removed the boar from the room. Heracles could barely hide his amusement, but did as he was told and set the boar free. King Eurystheus then crawled out of the jar in embarrassment and quickly sent Heracles on his 5th labor. Labor 5, the Augean Stables. For his 5th labor, Heracles was tasked to clean the Augean Stables in a single day, using only his hands and without any assistance. Eurystheus believed the task to be impossible, sending Heracles on his way, believing failure was certain. The stables belonged to King Augeas from the neighboring kingdom of Elis. They housed 3,000 immortal cattle and had not been cleaned for 30 years. The stables were so overrun with animal dung that in some places the filth had piled several meters high, and no one dared approach them due to the awful smell.
Upon arriving in Elis, Heracles visited King Augeas, who promised the hero 1/10 of the immortal herd as a reward if he was able to clean the stables before nightfall. As he made his way over to the stables, Heracles was bombarded with a horrid smell. It was even larger and more filthy than he had imagined, spanning the length of a small city. After taking a look around, Heracles himself thought the task impossible to complete. He instead headed to the nearby rivers Alpheus and Peneus, which he hoped would do the job for him. Obeying the restrictions Eurystheus had given him, Heracles used no tools, instead using his bare hands to dig a canal which flowed from the rivers down into the stables. Once completed, a great torrent of water came flooding into the stables, washing away years of filth in an instant. The water continued to flow into the surrounding farmland, fertilizing the fields with an enormous amount of manure. This caused celebration in Elis, with the people cheering for Heracles as their farms were to prosper for years to come. Heracles would mark this occasion by creating the famous Olympic Games, which would occur every 4 years in Elis. But not all was well, as Eurystheus would refuse to count this labor as one of the 10, as he claimed the task had been accomplished for payment in the form of a portion of the immortal herd. An additional labor would therefore be added to his service, bringing the new total now to 12 labors.
Labor 6. The Stymphalian Birds. For his 6th labor, Heracles was tasked with driving away a flock of man-eating birds from Lake Stymphalis. These birds were sacred to Eris and sported iron beaks capable of tearing through the toughest of armor. The birds were the size of herons and excreted poisonous droppings, rendering the surrounding area uninhabitable. Upon arriving, Heracles would find a pair of giant bronze rattles that had been placed on the fallen trunk of a willow tree by Athena. Thanking the goddess for her aid, Heracles would begin to shake the rattles, with the noise they produced causing the birds enormous pain, with hundreds of them rising from the lake forming a great flock above. Heracles then took his aim, shooting down as many as he could, until finally those that had survived fled the lake, with his 6th labor now complete. Labor 7. The Cretan Bull. When King Eurystheus saw his cousin returning successfully yet again, he realized that he had exhausted all of the difficult tasks within his kingdom. Needing more time to come up with one, he sent Heracles to Crete, an island near the Greek mainland, where King Minos would give him his next labor. King Minos had been gifted a beautiful white bull from the sea god Poseidon, with the expectation that he would sacrifice the bull in Poseidon's honor. Instead of doing this, however, King Minos decided to keep the bull for himself, thinking it too beautiful to kill. In revenge, Poseidon made the king's wife fall in love with the bull, with this union eventually leading to the birth of the half-man, half-bull creature known as the Minotaur, a creature that King Minos kept in a labyrinth beneath his palace. After the bull impregnated the king's wife, Poseidon turned it mad, with the bull running around Crete, destroying everything in its path. While Heracles was not destined to kill the Minotaur beneath the palace, that was a task destined for the hero Theseus, King Minos did want Heracles to capture the mad bull that was causing havoc in his kingdom. Accepting the challenge, Heracles went to confront the bull, and when the beast charged at him, Heracles would grab it by the horns and wrestle its head into the ground. After many hours had passed, the exhausted bull would finally submit, with Heracles then jumping upon its back. As the bull was a child of Poseidon, it could walk on water, and so Heracles would ride it across the seas to Mycenae to show Eurystheus proof of his achievement. With his task complete, and not wanting to kill an animal sacred to Poseidon, Heracles released the bull outside of the palace, where it went on to rampage the Greek mainland until it was finally, many years later, caught and killed by the hero Theseus. Labor 8. The Mares of Diomedes. For his 8th labor, Heracles was tasked with bringing Eurystheus the mares of the Thracian king Diomedes. These horses were fearsome creatures, known to breathe fire, with their aggression made worse by Diomedes feeding them the flesh of unsuspecting guests and strangers to his kingdom. As Heracles made his way to Thrace, he would be accompanied by his friend and lover Abderus, the son of Hermes. As they arrived, the pair made their way to the palace of Diomedes, where they witnessed the fire-breathing horses Heracles was tasked with collecting.
The mares were bound to the palace wall with cast iron chains, put on display for all to see, thrashing around and foaming at the mouth. But as he entered the palace to meet with King Diomedes, a foul-looking man with a nauseous stench, Heracles would hear a terrible scream behind him. Rushing out to see what had happened, Heracles would watch in horror as the horses ripped into the corpse of his young lover Abderus, who had gotten too close to them in his curiosity. Filled with rage, Heracles charged back into the palace, killing the guards and grabbing Diomedes by the hair, dragging him outside. Giving the king a taste of his own medicine, Heracles threw Diomedes to the monsters, who began to devour their master. The flesh of Diomedes was so foul, however, that the horses stopped eating him halfway through, forever put off the taste of human flesh. With the horses now docile, Heracles grabbed their chains and brought them back to Eurystheus, his task now complete. Labor 9, the Girdle of Hippolyta. For his 9th labor, Heracles was tasked to retrieve the Girdle of Hippolyta, a gold and leather belt that ensured victory in battle. It belonged to Hippolyta, daughter of the war god Eris and queen of the Amazons, a race of warrior women who could fight better than almost any man, with them routinely raiding local tribes to assert their dominance. So Heracles set off east, bringing with him a small band of warriors in case he had to fight the Amazons. However, on arrival, Heracles was surprised by the Amazons' hospitality, with Hippolyta herself taking a keen interest in him. Having heard of his famous labors and overcome by lust, Hippolyta would give him her girdle as a sign of her interest. But Hera, watching from Mount Olympus, could not believe her eyes. The task was going too well, and so to make this labor more difficult, she decided to intervene. Disguising herself as an Amazon, she made her way into the camp, walking among the women and sowing the seeds of distrust. Slowly convincing the entire tribe that Heracles had come to enslave them, the Amazons became outraged, mounting their horses and charging towards the men they had let into their camp. Heracles heard the commotion and rushed outside, where he saw the Amazons slaughtering his friends. He turned around in rage, thinking that Hippolyta had tricked him, keeping him away from his men so they could be slaughtered. Before the queen could explain, Heracles lifted his club and struck her dead, her girdle not protecting her as she had already given it to him. Heracles then ran outside, striking down any Amazon who challenged him. He managed to save a small handful of his companions, and the group hastily left the camp, heading home to Mycenae. Eurystheus had grown tired of Heracles beating any task laid before him, and so decided to send him to the farthest place he could think of, the island of Erythea. Labor 10, the Cattle of Geryon. For his 10th labor, Heracles was sent to Erythea to steal the cattle of a 3-headed giant known as Geryon. Heading southwest, he traveled along the African coastline, but it did not take long for Heracles, unused to the intense and scorching heat of the continent, to become annoyed with the sun itself. Halfway across the Libyan desert, he took out his bow and threatened to shoot the sun with one of his poisoned arrows if it continued to torment him. Quite distressed at this, the sun came down in its human form as the god Helios, begging Heracles not to shoot him. He promised to shine less intensely while Heracles was on his journey, also offering to give the hero his great golden cup, a vessel shaped like a water lily, that Helios used to sail around the ocean at night. Finally reaching the island of Erythea, Heracles was quick to see the herd of cattle he had to steal, along with Geryon, their giant 3-headed owner. But wanting to be done with his task quickly, Heracles didn't even bother to fight the giant, instead shooting Geryon with a poisoned arrow, killing him within seconds. Heracles then herded the cattle into Helios' cup and sailed home to Mycenae, where he delivered them to Eurystheus. Labor 11, the Apples of the Hesperides. For his 11th labor, Heracles was tasked with traveling to the garden of the Hesperides, the daughters of the night, and collecting the golden apples that grew on a tree there which granted immortality to anyone who ate them. Not only was the location of the garden unknown, but Hera had sent a 100-headed dragon called Ladon to guard the tree from which the apples grew. As Heracles set off to find the mythical garden, he first visited the Titan Prometheus, who he thought would know of its location. Prometheus, the creator of mankind, had been chained to the side of a mountain after stealing the fire of the gods to give to humanity. And by the time Heracles found him, this cycle of punishment had been going on for centuries. Taking pity on Prometheus, Heracles broke his chains and set the Titan free, finally bringing an end to the torment, with Prometheus then happily sharing the garden's location. However, he also warned Heracles that no mortal could pick the golden apples from the tree. Instead, he suggested that Heracles seek help from the Titan Atlas, as he lived near the garden. Following Prometheus' advice, Heracles would seek out Atlas, who was not difficult to find due to the Titan's immense size. Atlas had fought against the Olympians in the war between the gods and the Titans, but as he was defeated, Zeus forced him to hold up the sky for eternity as punishment. Approaching the Titan, Heracles explained his situation and offered to make a trade. He would temporarily hold up the sky and give Atlas a much-needed break, and in exchange, Atlas would collect the golden apples. Thankful to be free of his burden, even for a short time, Atlas accepted the deal and went to collect the apples, transferring the weight of the heavens onto the shoulders of Heracles. Though he had achieved the impossible before, even Heracles struggled to bear the immense weight he now had to hold. As time went on, his muscles began to cramp, his body began to shake, and he contemplated whether this would be the task that would finally break him. As the sun began to set, Atlas finally returned with a basket full of golden apples. With a grunt of relief, Heracles thanked the Titan, moving to give him back the sky. Not wanting to take it back, Atlas offered to take the apples to Eurystheus himself, promising he would return and bear the weight of the sky once more. But Heracles would not be fooled. He thanked the Titan for his generous offer to deliver the apples, and offered to hold the sky for a little longer, but asked if Atlas would take the sky back just for a moment so he could put on his pelt to cushion his shoulders and head. Knowing the pelt would make a great difference and none the wiser, Atlas placed the apples on the ground and took back the sky from Heracles. As soon as he was free, Heracles picked up the apples and bid Atlas farewell, quickly returning them to Eurystheus to complete his labor. Atlas was enraged, cursing at the hero as he left, with his roars shaking the ground for miles around. As decades passed and then centuries, Atlas would become a part of the world itself, being transformed into stone, with his giant remains becoming known as the Atlas mountain range of North Africa.
Labor 12. The capture of Cerberus. For his 12th and final labor, Heracles was tasked with capturing Cerberus, the three-headed dog that guarded the gates of the Underworld. Descending to the Underworld and approaching Hades and Persephone, Heracles would explain that he had been tasked with collecting Cerberus as his final labor. Knowing that helping Heracles would infuriate Hera, who had always looked down on him, Hades allowed Cerberus to be taken, but two conditions had to be met. First, Heracles must use no weapons to capture Cerberus, and second, once his task was complete, Cerberus must be returned. Agreeing to the terms, Heracles set out to face the beast. Just as he had done with the Nemean Lion and the Cretan Bull before, Heracles grappled with the dog, wrestling it for hours until the beast was utterly exhausted. With his club in one hand and Cerberus in the other, he dragged the dog by its chains and made his way back to the realm of the living. Heracles then delivered Cerberus to King Eurystheus, who once again chose to cower in his jar, a now permanent installation next to his throne. The king poked his head out of the top of the jar and, while shaking in fear, agreed to release Heracles from his servitude, granting him pardon for his past crimes. Heracles was filled with joy. He had finally atoned for his crimes and was to be a free man. But before embarking on his next journey, he fulfilled his promise and returned Cerberus to the land of the dead.